Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for the invite.
No, it's my pleasure. Uh, Dan, to say the least, you caught my attention recently, and I got tagged into a thread on Nostr where the discussion between terrain theory and germ theory is very much happening. And what I thought we would do today, as we discussed before recording, is just spend some time talking about that and what you're reading about and where that rabbit hole is taking you. Um, I like to keep the conversations as broad as possible, so we'll weave in all sorts of bits and pieces as well. But yeah, so what was the recent research that you were sharing, and why did it catch your attention?
Yeah, so I'm an emergency doc, and I'm always just sort of perusing different medical forums, and I follow the health literature pretty closely. And recently there was the concept of the germ has dates back a long time back to Louis Pasteur and
Mm,
pasteurization, but during COVID, there was, I guess a corner of sort of the freedom health movement that started to question the presence or absence of virology as like a legitimate science. And they make a lot of great points. They, point to a lack of isolation of viruses, a lack of real legitimate sequencing from start to finish of almost all viruses that have been documented. They point to a historical lack of great randomized control trials that show a a evidence for contagion, which we all take for granted. And so I read this, and I work in the emergency room. I always you know contribute a runny nose to a patient that coughed on me. I contribute a sore throat to a young child who brought something home from school. So our lived experience seems to be colored by the concept that we get sick from others. And it seems it's taught to us in medical school. It's passed down to us from our parents to our children, and we have run with this concept of contagion and germ theory for a long time. And during COVID, when reading many of these, rightfully so labeled somewhat fringe topics on the concept of the lack of a real virus in the world, it was just interesting. It was just fun to read these, essentially what seemingly seemed like to be heretical topics.
mm,
Until I discovered this researcher, and he was running a very wonderful group called the Viral Contagion Control the Viral Control Studies Group, and I think he's out of France. His name is Jamie Andrews, and he's been publishing essentially all of his research. You could say unpeer reviewed, but in a sense, it's the most peer reviewed because it's completely open. They videotape their science experiments. They release every single picture that they take with their electron microscopes. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to replicate virology with controlled studies. And so basically what that means is that when they run an experiment, you want to have a arm of the experiment where there's nothing happening. It is just pure it's the pure baseline of reality. And then you want to have another arm of the control experiment, the experimental arm, where there is actually something different about reality, whether that's you're introducing an illness, or you're introducing a medication, or you're introducing a particular therapy. But you want to make sure that the arms are only differ by that one variable. And one of the problems that virology seems to either have ignored or swept under the rug or taken for granted is that when they do virology studies, they never really provide a control arm. They always assume that a virus is present because they got the sample from someone who was ill. And so when you take a sample from someone who is ill and you follow the traditional Koch's postulate, which is the theory of germ transmission, is that you take a sample from someone who's ill, you isolate the presumed pathogen, you then grow that pathogen, you inject the pathogen into somebody who's not ill or an animal that's not ill, and you see the illness that you're studying, and then you finally take a sample from the newly infected person or animal, and you isolate the same thing that you infected them with. And so it's a very logical, deductive path of following an illness from the pathogen through the infected host, re-isolating the pathogen. And unfortunately, in virology, there's never a full showing of that postulate. There's always claimed isolation from a sick individual. There's always the claimed culture of that thing, and these are often done in different experiments. And then there's always the assumption that what is taken from the sample or the medium that's being grown is the same thing that was injected in it from the infected or sick host. And so virology just has, because it's in, maybe it's a bunk science, but it's also a very difficult science because you can't simply see what you're studying. So everything is done inductively. Everything is done through either inference or sort of secondary evaluation of what we think is happening. And we're making these assumptions about the microbial world by seeing different effects and inferring that a particular process is happening. So what Jamie's doing, going back to sort of your original question, is he is taking the cell cultures that that people grow in claim, quote unquote viruses in. They're called vero cells. I think they're monkey kidney cells. These cultures, and what he's doing is he's saying we are going to grow them in a very healthy medium. They use something called fetal bovine serum, and so it's a very nutrient-rich medium. They grow the cells, and then what we're going to do is, as in all experimental arms of all viral studies, and specifically, they were looking at the COVID protocols, we're going to then also grow them in a reduced fetal bovine serum media. So we're going to reduce the nutrients that they grow in. Virology does this often with the claim that we want a reduced medium of growth so that these cells are more fragile, so that the viruses will lyse from them, so that they'll be easier to conduct an experiment in a reasonable amount of time. And so they grow them in a rich medium to make sure that this is going to work, that everything's good. They claim that's the control. But then what they do is they do a sleight of hand, either intentionally or unintentionally, and reduce the concentration of the medium, essentially starving the cells. And then they observe the release of viral particles from these infected cells. That's that classic little circle with the spikes all over it that's coming out of a cell that we've seen in high school and college biology classes. They see those on electron microscopy, and they assume that is the viral particles being released after propagation in the cell and replication. But they've done it at a reduced nutrient medium. So what they've done is they've starved the cell, and we've released the particle. We see the particles being released. But what would happen if you had nothing in that infected culture? And that's what Jamie's doing, and that's what's so interesting, is that he takes the cells, he takes healthy cells that have, quote unquote, certified, completely sterile, no virus, no contamination. He grows them at 10%, and they grow well. Then he reduces it to 2%, no infection, no virus added to the sample, and you see the same outpouchings of these cells. They call them the cytopathic effects, sometimes it's referred to as CPE, and you see the viruses being released from the cells, but there is no virus, so what's being released? And so you come full circle, and you have to wonder if everything that we have thought about the concept of germ theory, whether it's bacterial germ theory or viral germ theory, and contagion, is potentially built on a foundation of sand, because what we're actually observing is malnutrition manifesting with malformed cells, which we see in his experiments. These malformed cells of our body releasing malformed DNA or RNA, which we could potentially think is a virus because we see it commonly in people who are suffering the same condition, whether they're suffering a vitamin D deficiency or a protein deficiency or a mineral deficiency, and they manifest with similar symptoms because we're all human, so we have similar makeup. So when we're similarly sick, we similarly make malformed cells, and we release that DNA and RNA from our cells, and we shed it in our mucal membranes, like our nose and our mouth, and we do pass things from people to people. And sometimes when we pass things from people to people, if contagion is actually true, which it debatably may not be, those things that we pass can make people unwell? Or is it that we are similarly in an environment with other people who might be suffering the same malnutrition because we're in the same family or the same house or we're living in the same climate in the same time of year, and we all manifest because it's the same biology with an illness that has nothing to do with contagion, nothing to do with an external particle, but all to do with the malnourishment of our cells, as this experiment is showing, where when you reduce the medium that a cell is grown in to the point of basic starvation and malnutrition, it looks like it is infected with viruses. And so that's sort of the broad overview, is basically that this malnutrition of these cells shows the exact same morphology and pathology that we would say is present in a viral culture, but there's no virus and it's just a malnourished cell.
Whoa. Dan, I'm going to give it to you. Best 10-minute opening fucking bang I've had on the podcast ever
Oh, thanks.
in 100 or so episodes. It's so cool to get context, and it's why the long form conversations are so good, because you just can't get it in a 5-minute clip. There's so much to it. Um, and there's now a ton of different directions I can go. But when I started looking at this recently, it was a comment my wife had made in the car, and she had gone down a number of rabbit holes herself and is very interested in holistic health and questioning kind of the food pyramid, for example, is one great, like, why so many grains? Are people healthy? Are they not? Why? And she said, oh, you should look at terrain theory versus germ theory. And we had this very specific example recently where first my daughter got some kind of gastro virus and she was puking in the kitchen on the floor and was sick for a day or so. And then my son got it, and then I got it. But then my other daughter and my wife, they were totally fine. Frustratingly for my wife, she was very busy kind of running around cleaning up sick, and very much from a germ theory perspective, being like, got to make sure that these surfaces are all clean so no one else catches it. But it was like, hang on a second, why would it be the case that these two other people very likely, have been literally in the same living space, not get sick? And that very simple fact puts under question germ theory completely. It's like, why such simple first principles like, well, hang on, why would they get sick and they not get sick? Um, and so when I started looking into the history of it, and you mentioned Louis Pasteur already, and Koch with the kind of the postulates that you've got to step through, and actually there's like a almost 200-year-old debate that's been going on in the science space that I actually referenced it to kind of like when I started asking the question, what is money? I realized, oh my God, there's this field of economics called Austrian economics and sound money. And I didn't even know they existed. But I was someone who's been highly trained in how to make money, going through business school and working in business my whole life. And you're like, hang on a sec, I didn't even realize that this was an option. And it's kind of the same for me with germ theory and terrain theory. So when you mentioned you're a doctor yourself, Dan, and you work in the emergency department, like how much time have you ever spent looking into these two different areas? And like, is it even part of your education when you go through the system?
I mean, no one spends. I mean, it is sort of like the old. I think it's Richard Feynman said like we're the easiest person to fool is yourself, and you can fool yourself by just assuming everything that you have been told is correct because your teachers seem benevolent. The educational system seems benevolent. Like they want productive members of society. You want emergency physicians. You want any physician to be well educated. Why would you be told something false? But we all know that most things in textbooks 20 years later are all disproven, and that science is a perpetual circle of disproving old theories and invalidating and falsifying claims. It never really proves anything. It always tries to falsify existing principles. And so you just don't think it's just something you don't think about. And only when you sort of ask why, like six, seven times over and over again, to finally get down to a first principle. And there has to obviously be some impetus for why you're even asking why in the first
Mm.
place. Do you begin to sort of uncover the fact that even germ theory itself is actually terrain theory, because no one in a germ theory camp would say that the medium that a germ is present in is not important. We know that when you culture a bacteria, it has to be cultured on the right medium. Most things we still don't know how to culture. There's something called the Great Plate theory where, why can we not figure out how to grow essentially anything in a petri dish? Because we don't even really understand the mediums that most bacteria need to grow. And so, even germ theory, where we say an infectious agent is possibly at the cause of illness, requires a medium in which that infectious agent can thrive and cause illness. So, even germ theory is terrain theory. Essentially, terrain theory is just an, a first principled acknowledgement that the environment in which a living thing is present matters.
Mm.
And so, in your case, with the gastroenteritis, the environment in which whatever toxin, bacteria, bad food, whatever took hold and caused, a expulsive reaction to your body, all that required an environment of the body in which it could take hold.
Mm.
And so even germ theory is terrain theory. And unless you really start to ask and think, or even have a reason to ask why about this, almost everyone in medicine, just assumes, rightfully so, that they, have been taught correctly. Because why would you assume you weren't taught correctly?
And so, through your medical education, like, did you even discuss terrain theory?
Oh
Was it
no,
something that?
no, it's not. No, similar to how you hear a lot of people talk about how they went through an economics degree and only learned Keynesianism.
Correct.
It is basically viewed, I think, more as like a naturopathic kind of quackery type
Mm.
uh, theory, because we know germs are true, right? Of course we know germs are true, and that sort of self enforces the perception that, well, germs are true, so why would you consider an alternative theory? But when you ask about germs, you realize that the only reason a potential germ could cause a problem is because it needs an environment in which it could cause a problem in, and that is terrain theory. And
Mm.
so even germ theory, even if it is wrong, is built on a more true principle that the environment in which a pathogen is present matters.
Cool. And it's so interesting, is that of course there's a very controlled environment within which the virology space is operating for it to then prove that this is the science and therefore it's correct. It's like, well, hang on, you're actually showing that terrain theory itself is true just by taking that approach. Yeah, really interesting insight. Okay. And so if you, to take a day-to-day example, like you start talking to a colleague about this subject, like are people interested, or
No,
is it
no
like,
one would be. No, absolutely not.
really?
There's no one will be interested in this because essentially it puts into question it. When you challenge a first principle, which this is one of the most fundamental first principles of medicine, that
Mm.
germs cause disease rather than a diseased host being a place in which germs can take hold
Mm.
and potentially eat
But
the
it's
dying
literally
tissue.
flipping it round, right?
It
I mean,
it,
the
it
idea
is
that, like,
such
oh, someone sneezes on you and you go, ah, but actually, like,
right.
it doesn't matter if you're in good shape. It doesn't matter.
Right. And what even might be even more strange to think about is that when you have a disease, that disease itself might be beneficial to you for that time period in which it is trying to clean up the the dying tissue or the malformed cells or the inadequately perfused area of your body. That disease is taking hold there as a beneficial cleanup to you. Just like algae will grow in a dirty pond and help clean the pond and aerate the pond. That you still need to also work to get better because that disease could run amok and hurt you. But the disease initially, when it takes hold, may be a beneficial signal to your body, one physiologically, that you need to now rest, take care of yourself, eat better, but also from a cellular level, potentially beneficial in that it is consuming a malformed or malnourished part of your body intentionally to get rid of something that is harmful to you.
Mm.
And so it even becomes one level deeper in that diseases, when we have them, may be beneficial, so that we can know to get better and also from a cellular level remove things that are damaged.
Interesting. And so with that lens, a sickness that you might get, or even like a chronic illness that's just rampant these days, right? Whether it be heart disease or any number of other different things that people kind of come across in their life, cancer, there's just so many different things that people have wrong with them. In some ways, they're actually a good thing because your
Well,
your your body is signaling that there's a problem. Would that be?
maybe. Maybe. I think the chronic diseases are something of a different story.
Yeah, okay.
I think what I'm talking mostly is the acute illness that is recoverable, that is temporary.
Like a gastro.
That
Yeah, it's like you
yes,
got to get it out, and that's actually a good thing. Yes,
but
okay.
the chronic illnesses, I think, are what you see. The chronic illnesses are what you see when you've permanently changed, almost irreversibly, the metabolism of your body. And so you have permanently damaged your coronary arteries from a high amount of blood sugar because you're diabetic. And that allows the cholesterol plaques to take root. And so, think about the cholesterol hypothesis since you brought it up. It is sort of analogous to terrain theory of infectious agents, in that the cholesterol needs a damaged blood vessel in the first place to embed itself in. It itself is not damaging the blood vessel, as we're often taught. Most physicians still believe that it is intrinsically damaging, but it can't be intrinsically damaging because our body is filled with cholesterol, and yet most people function on a high level, and our brain is cholesterol, our vasculature is cholesterol. But when you have a damaged environment, a damaged blood vessel, that cholesterol can take hold and form a plaque. And so, what then causes the damage to your blood vessel? That is the next question to answer, and that is most likely many of these oxidized particles that come from the consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids. It can be the excessive amounts of blood sugar that cause insulin resistance. It can be the pro-carcinogenic effects of a high concentrated amount of insulin that is never really fully used at the cell wall level. But it is an environment that is already ready to be that is already damaged, and it's just waiting for something to happen. The forest does not spontaneously catch on fire, but if it is left in a state in which it can catch on fire, then you see a forest fire.
Mm.
And so that is essentially the terrain theory of nutrition as well, which is that if you live a chronically unwell lifestyle, you are at risk for a normal physiologic process to become perverted and disrupted and lead to a chronic disease.
Wow. And this is a very powerful subject to have come across, actually, Dan, because sad story for me, my father had a heart attack and he died
Hmm.
now 16, 17 years ago. And he had something called a pulmonary embolism. He was only
Yeah.
48 years old. And I've always wondered why. Like, why did he die? And some part of it is definitely, like a classic 90s diet, chicken Kievs, and our family business was a beer and pub company. So he was often on the road and he'd sneak a chocolate bar here and there, or he'd have lunch in the pub that he was visiting. Um, Not a heavy drinker, but definitely was, consuming alcohol and overweight for his size. But I think ultimately it was stress, like the environment that he was in and the role he was working within the business at the time. There was a bunch of things that happened, and basically just his heart just couldn't handle it. And I wonder, and this is what struck me recently with the terrain, and well, at one point there he was taking statins, which I've since done some research on, and like very questionable whether or not actually like thinning your blood is a good thing anyway. Um, but the thing that I'm trying to get at here is this idea that the terrain theory it helps point out that really you're accountable. Like your body is only susceptible to these things if it's in a certain state of disrepair. And if you focus on optimal health choices, rest, sleep, eat, move, the environment that you're in, your lifestyle choices, your work, whatever the case might be, you can control those things. And with that being true, the ability for the terrain that you are as a human, um, it can get better or worse based on your choices. So one of the reasons that my father's no longer around is basically his choices. But from a terrain perspective, you go, well, actually, Dad, you could have done a bunch of different things, and that might not have happened. And the germ side of things would be like, take this prescription drug and blah blah blah. And there's a whole like portfolio of different options that have been patented, and it props up a very different incentive structure, like sell a solution rather than like no
Mm-hmm.
no, just it's basically your choices. And even that, I'm sure, is extremely triggering for a lot of people to think, well, actually, no, no, it's on you, mate. And it's much like becoming your own bank with Bitcoin. It's like, well, you can just take control of your own wealth and not trust anyone else, but you are responsible for it. And if you get it wrong, it's a problem. Um, so, does any of that resonate, Dan?
I mean, that is probably why most people are uncomfortable thinking about the terrain theory of biology, even though they implicitly acknowledge it with almost all of their actions, is because when you are forced to take personal responsibility, it does appear somewhat uncompassionate, even though it perhaps is the most compassionate and empathetic thing you can do, which is to empower somebody to be responsible for their own actions. But it does appear on the surface to be unempathetic when you can somewhat point in a blame like way to why you have done this to yourself and made yourself ill, even though we will try to help. The damage is done because of a series of very bad and uninformed and potentially misguided choices that you've made for a long time in your life. And that is tough. It is tough for, I think most doctors would not want to ever have that conversation with the patient because either they don't have enough time, they don't know the patient well enough to have that conversation, and it also is a little bit hopeless because for some situations, the choices that you have made in terms of your health can be unreversible. But that it does underscore that there is not necessarily, saying that there's terrain theory is really just saying that there is the first principle acknowledgement that your biology influences your interaction with the exterior world, and your interior environment is in communication with the exterior world. The exterior world is in communication with your interior environment, and the choices you make from both a metabolic standpoint are your responsibility, and they can be reversed sometimes with medications. But mostly you're treating symptoms. I'm in the sick care business. I don't make people healthy. If you show up with a broken arm, I can make you less sick. But most of medicine is sick care, not necessarily healthcare, because healthcare is a very personal responsibility, field which everyone can do on their own.
Mm. Actually, really like that definition differential there between healthcare and sick care. You kindly shared an episode you did with Caribou a couple of years ago, and I very much enjoyed listening to that conversation because like, it's so true, isn't it? It's that especially the emergency department of a hospital. It's like people are coming in with an emergency. It's like, yeah, I've fallen off the ladder, or I've been in a car crash, or whatever the case might be. Um, why do you think that it isn't better defined like that? Why is it all lumped into being healthcare? Do you think, like, because that
I
seems such an
mean,
obvious thing to point out?
no, I mean, I think we just live in a world where we're given terms and we accept them.
Mm,
It's the same reason why no one's thought about this topic that you're bringing up right now, is that, we're just told this is healthcare, this is health insurance, we're just, when you're born into a word, unless you really are somewhat rebellious in your thought, or very first principled, you don't question
mm,
why a term is used. Going back
yeah.
to the virology concept,
Born
if you
into a
if you've
money,
never
right? I grew up with
anything, I mean,
pounds in the UK.
we are
That's it,
born.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're born into an environment. The environment we live in is made up of people and rules and language and society, and some of it is just there for no reason. Some of it is there for bad reasons. Some of it's there for good reasons, but unless people can only question so much in their life and not go crazy. So they just accept things, and you will just accept the term that healthcare is healthcare, and that term health sounds great. This is healthcare. Everyone calls it healthcare. It's called health insurance. We need to give healthcare to everybody. And so you just associate health with with medicine, or you associate health with a hospital or a doctor. And then we have another word for nutrition. We call it nutrition, or we call it physical fitness. It does not call it health. So it's obviously good, but it's not as good as going to the doctor,
Mm.
or going to the dentist. Those things are what make me healthy because it has the word health in it. And so I think it's just that we were born into a world with language, and that language impacts how we think. We think in language, and unless you question the language and the principles under sort of underpin that language, you just sort of keep going in that system until you are presented with a situation that makes you ask why. And if unless you keep asking why, you may not really figure out what's going on.
And then that's the fun bit. I mean, that's why we're on a podcast here together, is that question, why? Like, why is this the case? And that's a good opportunity for me to kind of get back to this research that you were posting about, because what, and this is a non-technical summary of what you described, but it seems to me then, so when you stress the cell observably does the same thing, whether or not it's a virology experiment or a non-virology experiment. The the virus and the little cell break off, or whatever you describe it as, doing the
Yeah, the
same
vesicles.
thing. So the observation is, well, here is actually a genuine control group, and the control group behaves in exactly the same way as what the virology guys are trying to say is actually what their drug or process is doing. So what does that mean? And what are some of the ramifications that spring to mind for you for like, okay, this is actually pretty pretty serious stuff. What might change, or if anything, nothing. Maybe everyone's going to ignore it. I don't know.
Well, I think most people will ignore it, but what it does question is almost every piece of infectious disease as a field that we have learned for the last 100 some years. So
So like,
this
what,
is some of her.
masks fucking pointless, like
Well,
vaccinations
sure,
fucking pointless, like all
yeah.
this
So let
stuff. It's like it's actually not
yes,
about that.
yeah. So if you take so vaccination is an interesting topic. It because you in theory, just sort of you talk through it logically, and it does sound a little absurd, even though it's touted as the most you know his it's a societal changing component of modern medicine is the modern vaccine that has
Mm,
eradicated diseases. But if you take a vaccine, so what you do is you have in theory a protein that's related to a virus so that your body will recognize this viral particle if you're ever to encounter it in the wild and squelch the problem. So you inject that, but that alone is not enough because well, you would think it would be enough if I'm injecting a viral particle directly into someone's bloodstream, and this viral pathogen is indeed on the level of life-threatening disease that we claim it is. Injecting even a small amount where it can hijack this cell should be enough. So then we say, well, we're denaturing the virus, so that's why it doesn't it alone is not enough. So then you also need adjuvants. You need various heavy metals so that the body is immediately inflamed, not because of the particle that you're inducing, but because of the adjuvants that go along with the particle. And then you measure the antibodies later if you want to see if someone became immune to a disease. But those antibodies are very non-specific. Most antibodies have multiple diseases that they'll be positive for. And so you're not even sure, in theory, if someone is immune to a disease because that antibody can be positive. HIV is a good example. There's like 50 conditions in which you can have HIV positive antibodies but not have HIV. You can have tuberculosis and have a positive HIV antibody. You can be pregnant and have a positive HIV antibody. And so it questions the existence of many viruses as diseases. There are already people who have questioned the existence of HIV, and it is a troubling history in medicine to go down and read how it has come to be a defined disease, even though acquired immune deficiency is a real syndrome that people suffer from when their immune system is defunct. So it questions those diseases that are chronic viruses. It questions cancer-related viruses. We have associated, HPV with cervical cancer, and perhaps if a virus is not a product of the external world, but is a product of the nutrition, and we find this sequence of HPV in women who have cervical cancer, then we need to ask, well, why are they producing these fragments if it is due to a nutritional deficiency of their cells making these fragments? And we're not pursuing the correct cure because the cure perhaps might be some other deficiency that we have ignored. And so, what it really does is if these findings do begin to change medicine, is that it allows the attention to not be on the treatment, but more on the prevention of disease. And
Mm,
so, if the terrain is what is important, and that the nutritional state of individuals is what causes the manifestation of these fragments that we see associated with diseases, these RNAs and DNAs, we see them and we've sequenced them, and we find them whenever someone has a similar disease. But that similar disease is because other people have similar nutritional deficiencies. Then the focus of health basically changes from treatment to prevention,
mm,
because these are not something that's invading us that needs to be treated. These are things that our body is creating because of a deficiency that we then need to focus on preventing, and perhaps even curing by fixing that malady within the body. So it basically flips the script of almost all Western medicine from a interventional approach to a sort of defensive approach.
mm. It strikes me. It's kind of like you. It's like being downstream, isn't it? When you're looking at all of these symptoms and like, okay, we can solve this, solve that, but actually, when you flip it around, it's like, well, what's going on here? What's at the very source? And the illness has arisen due to previous actions, or in some ways, proof of work or lack of proof of work of someone's decision making has created the situation that they're in. And it's therefore, what did that person do? What environment were they in? What were their choices at the time? That then this manifested as a result. And perhaps that's why, if you go and see someone who's trained in Chinese medicine, for example, acupuncturist Claire, shout out to Claire, who's been over recently a couple of times to help my wife and I. And the first thing she wants to do is look at your tongue. You're like, you stick your tongue out, and they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then they start playing around. You're like, what are you doing? And all they're really doing is obviously checking to see the state of your body right now with visible signs that help to dictate the state that you're in. And that's preventative in a great sense, because you're then like, okay, well, that was a great session where you helped me to, and why I really like the acupuncture is dropping into a really deep parasympathetic state that is actually frustratingly hard to attain in the modern world, whether that's because you're driving a car and there's traffic lights, or whether you're on a mobile phone that's flashing at 400 different times a day, and you just can't get out of fight or flight. And therefore, sometimes getting practitioners to assist that, osteopath is another great way of doing it. You drop into like another state, meditation, you can do it that way too. And these are all things that, and it's one of the reasons why terrain theory really speaks to me so strongly, because like these are things you can go and do. And if it is true that it's basically what's happening upstream that's important prior to the disease manifesting, then that's great. These are all things that we can control to some degree. But wow, it really does have large ramifications to like flip the script, doesn't it? Um, could you could you envisage any major change to the system, quote unquote, that you're operating within today? And I like the idea of, from an entrepreneurial perspective, you got to play the playing field that exists in front of you, and don't complain about the fact that there's a tax or there's some regulation, because it's there, mate. but what's the way of operating in and around that? The medical system is a big beast that has profit incentives that misalign things in strange places. It has legal structures in place that remove any accountability in some ways, and it's a whole massive debate. Um, but with the simple insight that we've been discussing today of the benefits of focusing on your terrain and less worry or stress about germs, what might change, if anything, do you think, Dan?
Well, one, you yourself will change because you have nothing to worry about. Like if you are bathed in germs
Yeah,
every day,
it's so
yeah,
relaxing,
you
isn't
just,
it?
there
Go,
can be just a full release of
yeah, all
worry.
that
Like,
anxiety of yeah, so true.
yeah. From a therapy standpoint, it questions the utility of many vaccinations. Um, from a from a treatment standpoint, I think it questions the 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 treatments for many quote unquote viral diseases. It does not, totally burn down the system completely, but I think the second order effects of asking and finding this as a potential truth is that, I think it's probably similar. For Bitcoiners, is that they once they've asked one question and feel good about asking questions, they sort of can't stop questioning most things.
Mm,
And one of the things it could do, if it gains widespread acknowledgement that these are true controlled results that question most of existing virology, is that you question you feel comfortable questioning medicine.
mm,
People felt comfortable questioning money, and for a while, during COVID, people felt comfortable questioning their government. At least some people did. In physicians, very rarely question medicine. We just, if it's published, we think it's true, even though most of the publications are fairly polluted with, just garbage science. But if you once you question medicine, then you can question almost all diseases. You can ask, and you might find the same answer that is true. So you could question the cholesterol heart hypothesis. You could question the nutritional science. You can question the various treatments of chronic diseases. And once you start questioning things, one, it will make humanity better, but two, you'll feel comfortable thinking independently. And I think that would be sort of the biggest change to the system that could happen, is that if virology is ever proven to, or you never really prove anything in science, but disproven as a true science, and there's another reality that it better describes what is happening in our environment. Just like in physics, when you come up with a new theory and we finally discover that this is actually what's happening, or we're trying our best to approximate what is actually happening, you can make scientific advancements. You can actually perhaps have people really live longer. You could perhaps help actually cure chronic diseases. There's many reports of people with Crohn's disease switching to a carnivore diet and actually curing themselves rather than being on biologic modulators for the rest of their life and high dose steroids and never really being cured. So it could have second order effects of actually allowing physicians to feel comfortable questioning dogma if a major dogma is all of a sudden proven to be incorrect. For a long time, there's a classic story of gastric ulcers being seen as related to infection with a particular H. pylori agent, and so everyone started giving PPIs, and perhaps the reason that H. pylori bacteria is in your stomach in the first place is because of the creation of an excessively acidic environment from your dietary consumption habits, and the real treatment for chronic gastritis and gastric ulcers is as a result of just dietary modification. That is a sort of those are profoundly big changes that reduce the amount people have to spend on healthcare, and it's always concerning in areas of the country where you hear that healthcare is the biggest employer. because those are people not doing something else productive. Being an emergency physician is fairly, productive when you need an emergent stabilization. But being a doctor that, prescribes medications for people who have chronic illnesses doesn't really advance humanity unless those people who are taking those medicines also then can be more productive. And so healthcare is always a strange field because it's never really a productive field. It doesn't create new things. It doesn't it can help people live longer and less symptom free occasion, for some things. But what could happen is if people need to spend less money on quote unquote sick care, they now have more money to spend on other things,
Mm.
real healthcare, real entrepreneurial endeavors. And we spend a lot of money on things that perhaps don't work. And if you're willing to question some of those things that are not working, and it comes from the tearing down of a paradigm in medicine that we hold sacred called virology, then that could be a beneficial, a beneficial move in society where we're now spending less money on healthcare because we don't need it. It's not helping us.
And also, you make better decisions when you feel better. So, whatever the best approach might be to help those people struggling with disease and illness, should they shake the shackles of the scenario that they're in with better advice and improve their terrain and then suddenly see all of these different improvements in their life, they will think better. When you think better, you make better decisions. And so you're right, the compounding interest will be really exciting. Dan, I'm intrigued to take almost about a bit of a historical lens, where the average age or the average life expectancy has drastically changed. At least I believe it has in roughly the last 200 years. And a lot of the different reasons for that be like, better sanitation, or better water, or vaccination. Um, from this perspective, like germ versus terrain theory, what do you think's been the main driver behind life expectancy improvements? And when you say people might live longer from where we are today, how might they achieve that with this lens?
Well, the things you have mentioned, I think, are undoubtedly and unequivocally and unarguably what anyone in medicine would say is the main drivers of our longevity, which is the improvement and safety of our environment that we live in. We have electricity, we have running water, we have sanitation. Most people would be hard pressed to say that therapies within medicine have improved our longevity, because it's just there's nothing you could really point to. There's been no, you know, you can look at even maybe infantile illness is mostly prevented as a result of our ability to, a premature. Just take the most extreme example: a premature infant born, prematurely. We can keep that infant alive mainly not because of medication advancements, but because of mechanical advancements. We have small ventilators that can breathe for them. We can keep them warm. We can provide them nutrition. And take it to the other extreme, the elderly. The elderly are allowed to live a long, flourishing life as they age and become less mobile or, just, potentially more fragile as an individual as you age because of the mechanical and engineering and technological advances that we have in society, not because of medicines. I think no one would be hard pressed to say that blood pressure medicines are what's improving the longevity of our population. And many of the chronic diseases are actually shortening the lifespan of our population, and we're not curing these chronic diseases. We're just managing them. And so, to go back to your original question, I think we all acknowledge a sort of silently or maybe implicitly that it is the optimization of our environment taking us from the wild where things are tough, where a bear can only live 20 years, but a human, when taken out of the wild, can live 75, 100 years. It is the optimization of our environment to be safer. That is what is improving the health and longevity of us as humans. And it's why we're, the apex species on the planet, because we can modify our environment in a way that other species cannot. And we do so sometimes to our detriment, but in large part by making things safer and more mechanized, we do so to our benefit.
Mm. That's so interesting. As a as a medical man yourself, working in the emergency department, to point to essentially mechanical engineering and building a house and having air conditioning and running water and a bed. That wasn't what I was expecting your answer to be, but from a first principles perspective, that makes so much sense. Slash, we're also not in dangerous situations as much or as often as we would have been in the past. And I think about just the simple fact, if you were part of some kind of hunter gatherer tribe and you had a bad broken leg and you couldn't move, well, how do they take you with them? Right, as a nomadic, you couldn't, right? You'd be basically, you'd probably be left behind pretty much. Whereas now
Right.
it'd be
We see
like,
this. Yeah.
take 6 months, put a cast on, you can have some sick
Yep.
pay or whatever the
Hmm.
case might be.
Yeah, and we see this in international medicine all the time. People will go into a small village in pick Nicaragua, and we're gonna give them dental care for 6 months. But what they really need, that's fine. It looks great, and you feel good, and everyone there gets their teeth cleaned, or you do you teach them about using an ultrasound or something like that.
Mm,
But what really is beneficial is the electrical infrastructure that is there, or the EMS system that actually can function, because you have ambulances on roads that can move people from a rural area to an urban area when they need an emergent stabilization,
mm,
or the ability to aerovac people out. But the building of power plants, those are the things that improve the health of that region more than the esoteric medical therapy that you might happen to teach a rural community that's impoverished. I don't do anything productive for society unless the people I save in the emergency department do something productive when they leave the emergency department. I am not a net producer in society unless the people that I help are net producers. My job is just to treat an emergency so that people can then leave the emergency to be a net producer and a net benefit to the world. But me, myself, in the emergency department does nothing productive for society unless the people I help then do something productive for society.
yeah, that's a cool insight. And so, Dan, to spend some time, like, what is your day job like? Could you paint a picture for me?
Yeah.
When you start, when you finish, what are the kind of average customer?
Yeah.
It's not a customer; it's someone who's got a broken
Sure. Yeah.
arm. Do you know what I mean?
No,
But
but
like, what's it
yeah, it's
like?
like a restaurant business, though. No, it is. I mean, we're a service industry. Um, I work shifts, so days, middle of the day, some night shifts. You work holidays, you work weekends, you do your mixture of everything. I work for a university, so we also teach. We teach students. We have residents that are in their training. And a day in the life in the emergency department is somewhat unpredictable, but the clientele is a mixture of people with extreme trauma and illness to the worried well, and it's a mixture of all of those in between.
Mm,
And we're always triaging to make sure that those that are worried well are taken care of, but maybe at a lesser speed than those who are critically ill. And most of it, as emergency physicians, we know, and we can't really forget. We're one of the sort of the last few bastions of generalists within medicine, where we can't really forget what we've been taught in medical school and just sort of focus on one particular field, and then let some of that other core principles drift away. We sort of always have to be remembering the first 20 to 40 minutes of all specialties within medicine, caring for people sometimes for many hours when they're in the ER, across multiple disciplines. Not, almost as, you would think of your classic traveling physician in the olden days that sort of could take care of everything and knew a little bit about everything and may not be the world's expert on one particular thing, but knows enough to be able to diagnose essentially any disease with relative certainty, and be uncomfortable a little bit with some of um, the unpredictability that they could be wrong, but manage symptoms and stabilize individuals who need emergent therapy. And that's where medicine really shines. Is medicine is, again, we talked about a little bit about the sick care, but medicine is a symptom management tool so that you can get through an emergent situation. And I think medicine has its most positive effects in people who have emergencies, because that is where symptoms are often the greatest and the potentially um, uh, most difficult to manage and potentially the most life threatening. And by managing those symptoms, whether it's someone who's about to have a cardiac arrest, or someone who is having a cardiac arrest, or someone who just had a traumatic event from a motor vehicle accident, or someone who's psychologically in a very fragile place, managing those symptoms, quickly and empathetically and also, effectively, has the most bang for buck in medicine in the emergency department in comparison to almost all other specialties, probably short of surgery and OBGYN. And so it's a very fulfilling job because you do see how modern medicine can fix things from a symptom basis, so that people can recover later.
So cool. And I would imagine that some scenarios are very stressful. How, as like someone's come in, they're irate, they're angry, they might be drunk, who knows? But as the doctor on the floor, like how do you manage those situations? You guys obviously must have training in terms of like stress management and also like situations that appear. But um, yeah, how do you deal with those kind of scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I think in almost any, you just don't take anything personally. I mean,
Mm.
I think that's mostly where
It's great
people,
advice.
in life as well. You have an angry neighbor, you have a difficult, colleague. You just, if you don't take anything personally, well, then there's no reason to be emotionally invested in what seems to be like a very traumatic situation, because you are just doing things in a need based way. That this needs to be done, we're doing this. This doesn't need to be done, we're not doing that. And if you're very just sort of logical and unemotionally invested in the situation, then I find that those probably make the best people who can deal in emergencies, because there's no meltdown that can take place because I'm not invested here. I'm looking for a good outcome, but I'm not emotionally invested. I'm just intellectually invested.
Mm. Yeah, okay. There's probably all sorts of different um, tactics in that sense where because yeah, someone else's trauma is not your problem in the
It's not
sense of
my trauma,
like
it's their
it's
trauma.
their trauma. Yes.
Right.
And so Dan, just sorry, very quickly, we've hit up on the hour. Do you have some more time to continue
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yeah?
if you want to keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll shoot for another kind of 20 minutes or so. Um, okay, fascinating because when you say that you're not a net producer, I struggle to kind of square that away in a sense because it's such a skilled job that you do. Like that's
Hmm.
an incredibly important part of an economy, right? Is like some people, economic actors, get they become unproductive for whatever reason. So the quicker you
Yeah.
can patch them up and get them back out again, the better. Um,
Sure.
but to describe
Yeah,
yourself
I'm
as
not. I'm not a rent. Yeah, no, I think maybe I'm thinking about it incorrectly, but I'm not a rent seeker either. I'm not extracting from the system, but I'm there. As a physician, I'm basically a stabilizer for a functioning system. So
mm,
the system, the society, the world, the economy has to be functioning for me to have a role in helping individuals,
yeah,
from a very Austrian standpoint. I work on an individual basis, but that individual then has to do something later. Me stabilizing
yeah, to cover the
broken
cost,
limbs,
yeah,
yeah, me stabilizing broken limbs does not produce anything, no new innovations, nothing. I use innovations that other people have produced to help with emergencies. And I help individuals who are in emergencies get through it so that they can then innovate, produce, and provide services to others within society. So, in a sense, I'm like a lubricant for an already productive society.
yeah. That's a cool idea because it's almost like the inevitable entropy that exists within a complex system. Like stuff's going to break, like it or not. But therefore, having a way of patching it up is the key, and that's essentially what you do. Gosh, cool. Okay, and so what I'd love to spend a bit of time doing now, Dan, is we've obviously connected over Nostr, which is something that most people have never even heard of. But before we kind of get to that, it's Bitcoin. So, how did you come across Bitcoin, and um, how's it kind of changed your life? Um, and to not to tell your story for you, but I always really enjoy meeting people that are highly skilled professionals that have figured out Bitcoin's a good thing and carry on doing what they were doing and just use Bitcoin on the back end to help them, which is what I
Mm,
assume you do.
right.
But yeah, I'd love to learn some more about how you ended up coming to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I was a poor resident. I trained out in Los Angeles area, so I was living in Long Beach, and I just remember reading a Slashdot article. I'm always been somewhat interested in technology, and I just thought it was fun. You wire some money to Mt. Gox, and you think you're never going to get anything, and then this little token appears on your online wallet,
Hooray!
and you learn about downloading Electrum, which was the wallet back then, and or multi-bit, and you just sort of say like, oh, this is cute, this is fun. I've got student loans to pay. I'm just sort of forget about it. And you never really made any connection beyond it seemed like a neat little thing that was similar to BitTorrent, where everyone around the world could have a part in this ledger, just similar how everyone around the world could potentially share movies or music and or Linux distros or whatever, the legal thing you were sharing. And it was just that was sort of the end of it. But being financially strapped also because you've got student loans and you don't make a lot of money as a resident, um, always creates some pressure for you to think about ways to get out of debt faster or to just become more financially stable and less living paycheck to pay off student loans. And so then as you learn more about it and you're willing to ask why does this work this way? Why do I have to invest in the S&P 500? Why do I have to always put money in a Roth contribution to be tax free in the future? What is it growing at? Why am I doing this? You begin to think back to that little token that you got from Mt. Gox, and you realize that nobody else can take that token from you, and that token is a fixed percentage of total circulating supply. And I read the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean, and that probably really opened my eyes to beyond just um, the technical coolness of how Bitcoin works and how it is essentially uncontrollable. Um, it just becomes logical, and to not understand it after reading a book like the Bitcoin Standard and actually using it on a computer and seeing it actually work and restoring a wallet on a different computer and seeing that you own this thing that is intangible but actually real. To not understand it after doing that would be absurd. And so I think most people that probably don't understand it have just not given it the time to really understand it. But again, it is just money. And again, money is the most, I say, go back to me. I'm an unproductive member of society, but I am essential for the productive class of society to be productive. Money is also the most unproductive thing. It does nothing. It sits there, and it is a, it is a, it is a record of having done something productive, but it itself is an unproductive asset. And by being so interested in an unproductive asset, as many people who then sort of want to work in Bitcoin and be in Bitcoin, I think is a little troublesome sometimes because if you unless you're working on the tech in Bitcoin or educating people about Bitcoin, you do need to just do what you're actually good at in society because focusing so much on an unproductive asset like money, I think, is somewhat harmful. And what is most useful is using a money that is unproductive and good and high quality so that you can then do something good in society. And that's sort of where I come at it. So I still work as a doc. I'll work as a doc as long as I can. It's an enjoyable position, and having a good money is just a tool to allow some aspects of my life to be less stressful.
Mm.
And that's sort of how sort of I've come to think about it.
And to highlight then, because I always love how does it actually make a difference for you? So
Mm.
you mentioned student loans, perhaps that's an area, but when you say it helps make parts of your life less stressful, obviously no specific details have to be mentioned, but like what are you referring to exactly? Like if someone out there was
Oh,
listening and saying, "Oh, should I get closer to Bitcoin?
mm-hmm.
What would it actually do for me?" Because
Yeah.
real examples are great.
Yeah, so I think the easiest example is you no longer, most doctors have a financial advisor they pay. Most doctors will max out every retirement account and constantly sort of be thinking about either day trading or doing various, real estate investments. And all of those things slowly over time become consumptive of your attention.
Mm,
So you have to meet with the advisor once a year. You've got to manage a couple rental properties that somebody told you was a good idea. You've got to think about the allocation of your stocks, bonds, and alternative investments, and all these things you have to think about. And so I think the biggest benefit to me is just the cognitive unloading that takes place. I don't need to think about all those other things. I'm fine from the finance standpoint. I can hold money. My money will appreciate. If something I think is a better investment than the appreciation of my money, then I'll make that investment. And I can then spend time to go down rabbit holes for other things, such as I can read about virology literature. I
mm.
can spend time learning about the Mitochondrial Association of Nutrition. I can be a better emergency physician. I can learn how to teach my children how to read and write and do math. And so it is a cognitive unload because it frees time from some of the other sort of financial, you know, time pit holes that a lot of people get sucked down.
Yeah, actually, shout out to Tarek Samor who came on the podcast. I can't remember how many episodes ago now, but he's a surgeon based here in Australia, and taught me about that fact. It's like he knows surgeons on big money, and with the big money salary, you can then leverage that, and you can get into the real estate market, and you buy one place, and you buy another place, and whatever. And in the last like 4 or 5 years, interest rates have become more and more expensive, and basically, there's a bunch of really stressed, highly paid surgeons out there that are going into operating theatres thinking about the fact that their real estate portfolio is now actually causing them a headache, not storing their value over time. And you're right, like a cognitive, what's the right way of saying it? It's like,
Oh, like cognitive unloading. Yeah.
yeah, it's so true. And it applies to lots of different areas, but this specific one's a good example because you really need the person walking into your surgery or the person there, Dan, on the door of emergency, being like, come on in, not thinking about their stocks and bond portfolio that's gone down the tin and they haven't been able
Right. You
to
mentioned,
effectively save. Um,
yeah.
you need someone to be
And
there and present and on the fucking game.
right, and that's why we go back to how do you stay calm in the emergency department. You need to have your own emotional house in order,
Mm,
or you will become emotionally unstable in stressful situations. It's like the old adage that you can't love anyone else unless you love yourself.
mm.
Like you can't be a good spouse unless you also love, are a good individual. And if you have your emotional house disordered, and that could be disordered because of lots of financial stresses, then it will be tough to be emotionally ordered when the time comes and it's, a life or death type situation.
And so tell me, Dan, in the emergency department, how many other people have you managed to persuade Bitcoin is a good idea?
Probably five most, very few, and who knows how much they really get it as well. But if someone wants to ask me about it, they know that I'm interested in it. But mostly it's probably neither the place or the time to talk about it. And
Mm.
so it's only if it comes up in passing where someone mentions their Dogecoin and I ask them how much Bitcoin they have or what
Yeah, you're like,
do
sell
they know
that.
what Dogecoin
Yeah.
do you really know what Solana is, yada yada.
But, and I find these points interesting. We're so early. No one really has adopted Bitcoin in a meaningful way. When I think
No.
about my direct, like people that I've met in my lifetime, 5,000 people or whatever it might be, 50 of them might own Bitcoin. And that's in
Yeah, no
my,
one.
you know,
Yeah,
like no
yeah.
one owns this stuff. But what I found fascinating is when you talk to people that have gone and done the work by mistake or by choice, it doesn't really matter. But you dot together 4, 5, 10 seemingly spurious life experiences to something that actually this is really, really important, and start saving, whether it's through a DCA or they decide to reallocate from other investments into Bitcoin. And then as years go by, their lives improve and they're making progress faster in my, at least from what I see, than everyone else. But we're still so early. So when you get that lens on, Dan, like how excited are you about the future? You know, if you think about how, I mean, I think more clearly than most people, and I think I'm making better decisions than most people, and I think I'm happier than most people because of the position I've created for myself. Um, it's hard to compare, right? You know, I can't verify how someone else feels, but if I'm a small microcosm of what the future might look like, and then I chat with yourself, and I think about what the future emergency department might be like on a Bitcoin standard, what does that open up for you? You know, we
Yeah, I
are
mean, we're
so early,
probably
right?
yeah, we're probably in a science dark ages and we don't realize it. I mean, the amount of you
Wow.
would never waste money on a junk study of various random associations of this and that when you had to spend real money to do it. You would only fund like the most highest of highest impact research. Like you would fund physics research. You would fund curative research. You would never fund chronic management of X, Y, or Z or association of, someone with, X condition living in some place. You would only fund the highest quality research
Wow.
because you would be parting with, there's, the fiat science of just junk pollution in the literature. I mean, there's so many publications that, because the incentive to publish that is so high that all that matters right now is quality or quantity. And what we will probably move to is something of massive quantity of high quality research that really advances humanity, that is not just puff pieces to fill a resume. I think that is sort of the most exciting thing that would happen when there's a real cost on the line of doing an experiment, is that you will do an experiment that is most likely going to produce incredibly high quality impact because you're also departing with something of equally high quality. Like,
Mm.
when you give something away that is high quality, you would want high quality in return. So if you give away high quality money, you should expect high quality science in return.
It makes me think about, uh, from an investing lens, the cost of capital for the last 50 years has basically been the base rate of a central bank, and vis-a-vis some kind of government bond. It's like, right, well, your risk-free rate of return is 4% over the next 10 years with this UK gilt or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And I am now fully of the opinion that the risk-free rate of return is actually Bitcoin. And so if you're not potentially going to get higher than a 50, 60% CAGR, then why are you investing in this other asset? And that's assuming that the risk reward is the same in the other asset. There might be there might be counterparty risks, there might be liquidity risks, there might be all sorts of different reasons why actually the other asset is even far riskier than Bitcoin. And it's just made me think about how you just described medical research. It's like the hurdle rate for the choice of money to be spent on a medical research project is going to get much, 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 much higher. And
And
with
same for
that,
therapy as well.
uh,
Same for therapy
it'll
as
be,
well. A
it'll be,
medicine, a treatment, a doctor, all of it.
yeah,
The
wow.
CAGR gets applied to real. The opportunity cost is applied to real life.
Oh, okay. So let's unpack that a little more. What do you mean? So the opportunity cost is applied to real life. What does that mean?
So, right now, when we pay for a medical therapy, often a third payer pays for it. They pay for it, with U.S. dollars, but that's coming from an insurance company. The insurance company, um, so right now it appears to most people that there's no opportunity cost for paying for stuff because somebody else is paying for it. They're also paying for it with, garbage money, but that doesn't really matter. So say, you have a healthcare system on a Bitcoin standard. That means if there is insurance, which there probably will be, insurance has existed forever, there will be also insurers who are operating on a Bitcoin standard. So insurers also recognize their opportunity cost. And so they will want to encourage as little payouts as possible. But if they don't pay out when people need it, people will leave the insurance company and they'll go somewhere else to an insurance company that is reputable. So insurance companies will be forced to be good. And when they're forced to be good and pay out when things are required, they'll also want to make sure that the person that they're insuring is getting healthier, because as they get healthier, they will need less payouts, but they'll still carry their insurance. So the insurance company will get to make some more money because they will pay less for good, just like good drivers make more money for a car insurance company than bad drivers do. And so at the same time, when they pay out for their good, healthy customers, they want to make sure they're paying out to a good physician. They'll make sure they want to be paying out to a good, reputable, high quality therapy. They'll want to make sure that that good, high quality, reputable therapy improves the longevity and prosperousness of their insuree, so that the insuree still has a job and has money and savings so they can keep paying the insurance premiums. And so the whole system feeds positively on itself because nobody wants to waste money.
Mm.
They all want to prosper, and their net worth is essentially a reflection of how prosperous they are.
And when you lay it out like that, it makes it such a kind of laughable statement that you couldn't have a deflationary money. That society wouldn't work if that existed. But I call bullshit. Like my life's improving, sitting on a deflationary money. Thanks very much. But it's this idea that like the most saleable good, to use the Austrian lens, and that's why the Austrian economics is so key as part of this learning journey, because it's like, this is economics that actually kind of makes sense. It's like, why do people make decisions? It's like, that's what economics actually is. Okay, cool. Let's learn some more about it. But as you describe, it's like people aren't going to exchange the most saleable good that's going up in purchasing power over time for crap. It's like, no, my decision making bar has just got much, much higher. So unless you offer me a quality service that's going to be completed on time and actually give me what I need, then I'm going to go to someone else because you're giving me a shit deal. And that just changes the incentive for everything. Um, wow, it's going to be a very, very different world, isn't it? Let me ask you this then. So, what kind of time frame do you think we're looking at, Dan, for Bitcoin to seep into the wider economy? Because, like, let's be honest, at the moment it's still pretty fringe. Even though, yes, there's ETFs, yes, there's Bitcoin on the balance sheet of companies. Yes, there are individuals that have gone out and become Bitcoin maximalists and self custody their wealth, and people can now, sell $9 billion worth of Bitcoin and whatever. It's still very early days in terms of, I think, the penetration into the wider economy. How long might this process take, do you think?
I'm hopeful that my kids will experience that. I don't think I will. I think just like I think language, we're talking about, you're born into terms and you're born into, I think it's very hard. There's a saying that science advances one death at a time. I think society also does that. And I think it's going to take maybe one or two generations of people to not be influential over society, whether they've aged out, or they've just lost influence but I think it's going to be at least another generation. I'm
Mm,
hopeful that my children experience that world that we're talking about
mm,
because they will come up in a world that has only ever known, or from their parents, if their parents taught them about Bitcoin. Um, and it might even be longer than that because it will then require them to then teach their grandchildren about it, or
mm.
my grandchildren about it when they teach their kids about it. And so I think these things take a long time because money is like a cultural change when you change a money.
Mm.
And to change a culture is to need to change, I think, many generations.
Yeah, and as I sit here thinking about it, it's like, okay, So Bitcoin's 15 years old. So if you're 15 today, you've never not known a world in which Bitcoin existed. But in another 15 years, they're only going to be 30. I turned 37 in June this year. And whilst it's true that I can make decisions within my sphere of control, there's not many 37-year-olds that actually do much in terms of like positions of power. So, the presidents of countries and the kings and queens, they're like, commonly octogenarians, like proper boomers. And it's another 30 years on top of that. So for large organizations and institutions to actually be managed and run with decision makers, that it's a long time off from now, isn't it? Um,
Yeah, I think until we see the societal effects that we talk about in this like deflationary, that like Jeff Booth's book, that this the real advances that humanity can see when everything is cheaper, and we do have this opportunity cost with reality that is truly based in physics and the time that we have. I think that's going to take a long time. I think people will get fabulously rich in between, but the true societal benefits that we hope will
mm,
happen from this type of technology, I think will take a while.
mm. Yeah, cool. Okay. Dan, so we've been going an hour and 20 minutes or so now. I would love to get just one last question in, which is really to throw it to yourself. So, is there anything that we haven't covered today that you wanted to comment on, or that's come up that resonated, or equally the research that we first kicked off with, just to close things out?
No, I think we talked through a lot of stuff. If you really want to go deeper on some of this, I mean, if you can get Jamie Andrews to come on your podcast, he's done a couple appearances and he's
Ah,
pretty
cool.
well spoken about it, and it could be a fun episode.
Well, definitely. I'll have a look at that. Thank you very much. Well, Dan, if anyone wants to reach out and get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I mean, I'm really minimally active on social media except for posting some science stuff on Nostr. So if you follow me there, then I'll post about metabolic health and other things that I read about in biology.
Cool. Well, I'll post a show note with a link to your Nostra in there. So, Dan, awesome. We'll have a wonderful day because it's early with you and late with me. So, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Jake.
My pleasure.